The late afternoon sun hung low over the Colorado Territory, casting long shadows across the parched grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The year was 1882, and the frontier town of Dry Creek stood like a weathered scar on the face of the prairie, its wooden buildings bleached gray by years of sun and wind. Dust devils danced between the storefronts, and the air carried the scent of leather, horse sweat, and distant rain that never seemed to arrive. Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against the grimy window of the stagecoach, her heart hammering against the whalebone stays of her corset. 6 days of bone-jarring travel from Boston had brought her to this moment, to this place that seemed as foreign as the moon. Her gloved hands clutched the worn letter that had been her lifeline these past months, the careful script of a man she'd never met, offering marriage and a new life far from the shadows of her past. The coach lurched to a stop with a groan of wood and iron, sending up a cloud of dust that made the other passengers cough and curse. Margaret gathered her meager belongings, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the few precious items she hadn't sold to pay for her passage west. Everything she owned in the world fit in that single bag, a thought that should have terrified her but instead felt strangely liberating. "Dry Creek," the driver bellowed, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "End of the line for them heading to the Sullivan Spread?" Margaret's breath caught. The Sullivan Spread. Her destination. Her future. She smoothed her traveling dress, a practical gray wool that had seen better days, and tried to calm the trembling in her hands. 24 years old, widowed at 21. She had learned that life rarely offered second chances. This mail-order arrangement might be her only opportunity to escape the factory work and boarding house existence that awaited her back east. As she stepped down from the coach, the heat hit her like a physical blow. Boston's humid summers had not prepared her for this dry, penetrating warmth that seemed to leach the moisture from her very bones. The main street of Dry Creek stretched before her. A general store, a saloon with bat-wing doors, a hotel that had seen better days, and various other establishments whose purposes she could only guess at. Eyes watched her from doorways and windows. She could feel the weight of their curiosity, their judgment. A woman alone, arriving on the afternoon stage, could mean only one thing in a town like this: mail-order bride. The words seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. 3 years had passed since the fever took James, her young husband, leaving her with debts and a tarnished reputation in Boston society. 3 years of working her fingers raw in a textile mill, dodging the advances of her foreman, counting pennies for rent and bread. When she'd seen the advertisement in the Boston Globe, "Respectable rancher seeks wife, Colorado Territory," something had stirred in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or desperation. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Thomas Sullivan. That was all she knew of him beyond the sparse details in his letters. 35 years old, widower, owner of 800 acres of cattle land. His handwriting was strong but unpracticed, the words chosen with care but lacking in poetry. He needed a wife. He'd written, someone strong enough for frontier life, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about the past. That last part had decided her. They both had ghosts to bury. A figure emerged from the shadows of the hotel porch, and Margaret's heart stuttered. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor and a face carved by wind and sun. Dark hair curled from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. And his eyes. She couldn't quite make out their color from this distance, fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to physical work, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. As he drew closer, she could see the lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw that suggested he'd ridden hard to get here. His clothes were clean but worn. Dark trousers, a white shirt that had been mended more than once, a leather vest that bore the scars of countless days under the sun. The crowd seemed to part before him, and the whispers grew louder. Margaret heard fragments. Sullivan's bride, all the way from Boston. Wonder if she knows about. But then he was there, standing before her, and the rest of the world faded away. His eyes were gray. She saw now, the color of storm clouds over the prairie. They held something she couldn't quite name. Pain, perhaps, or a wariness that matched her own. "Miss Margaret?" His voice was rough, as if he didn't use it often. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. This was the moment she'd imagined 1,000 times on the journey west. The polite introduction, the careful courtesies, the slow dance of two strangers bound by paper and promise. But Thomas Sullivan, it seemed, was not a man for dancing. Without warning, without a word of greeting or explanation, he stepped forward, cupped her face in his calloused hands, and brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was neither gentle nor brutal. It was claiming, desperate, as if he were a drowning man and she were his last breath of air. Margaret's carpetbag fell from nerveless fingers. She should have been shocked, should have pulled away, slapped him for his presumption. But something in the raw need of that kiss spoke to the lonely places in her own heart. Her hands came up of their own accord, gripping his vest, and for a moment she kissed him back with equal fervor. The world exploded around them in whistles and catcalls from the saloon, shocked gasps from the respectable women, but Margaret heard none of it. There was only the taste of whiskey and loneliness on his lips, the solid warmth of his body against hers, the feeling that she had stepped off the edge of the known world and was falling. When he finally released her, they were both breathing hard. His hands still framed her face, and his gray eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Welcome to Dry Creek, Mrs. Sullivan," he said roughly. And only then did she realize he had kissed her before ever speaking her name. The crowd pressed closer, full of curiosity and crude remarks, but Thomas ignored them all. He bent to retrieve her carpetbag, then placed a possessive hand at the small of her back. "Come," he said. "We've got 20 miles to the ranch, and I'd like to make it before nightfall." As he guided her toward a wagon waiting at the end of the street, Margaret touched her lips with trembling fingers. They still tingled from the kiss, and she wondered what kind of bargain she had truly made. The Thomas Sullivan of the letters had been reserved, proper. This man who had claimed her with a kiss before the entire town was something else entirely. The wagon was sturdy but plain, pulled by 2 solid draft horses. Thomas helped her up onto the seat with surprising gentleness, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. As he walked around to the other side, Margaret became aware of the audience they'd attracted. Women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands. Men lounged against posts with knowing smirks, and from somewhere came the sound of laughter, harsh and mocking. "Don't mind them," Thomas said as he settled beside her and took up the reins. "They've got nothing better to do than gossip." "You certainly gave them something to gossip about," Margaret said, finding her voice at last. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That was the idea. The ranch house appeared just as the last rays of sun painted the sky crimson and gold. It sat low against the landscape, built of rough-hewn logs and crowned with a tin roof that caught the dying light. Margaret's first thought was that it looked lonely, a solitary structure defying the endless expanse of grassland and sky. Thomas hadn't spoken more than a dozen words during the journey, responding to her attempts at conversation with grunts or single syllables. Now, as he helped her down from the wagon, Margaret felt the full weight of what she'd done. She was 20 miles from the nearest town, alone with a man who'd kissed her like he owned her before even speaking her name. "This is it," Thomas said unnecessarily, grabbing her carpetbag. "Come on, I'll show you inside." The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen, dining, and living area, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was functional, sparse, a table and 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the stone fireplace, shelves holding a few dishes and supplies. It was clean, she noted with surprise, though dust motes danced in the last shaft of sunlight through the window. "Your room's through there," Thomas said, nodding toward one of the doors. "I'll bring in water for washing. Supper's usually at sundown, but we're late tonight." Margaret stood in the middle of the room, still wearing her traveling clothes, feeling utterly displaced. The kiss at the stage depot burned in her memory. But now Thomas seemed to have retreated behind walls of his own making. "Mr. Sullivan," she began. "Thomas," he corrected without looking at her. "We're married now. Or will be once the circuit preacher comes through. Might as well use given names." "Thomas, then." She took a breath. "About what happened in town." "Had to be done." He set her bag by the bedroom door. "People need to know you're mine. Saves trouble later." The casual possessiveness in his voice should have angered her, but instead, it sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Margaret had been a possession before, first her father's, then her late husband's, but never had anyone claimed her with such raw intensity. "I see," she said, though she didn't, not really. "And am I to have no say in how I'm claimed?" He turned then, and she saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes. "You had your say when you answered my advertisement, when you got on that stage, when you didn't slap me in front of the whole town." His voice dropped lower. "Did you want to slap me, Margaret?" Heat flooded her cheeks. That's hardly—" "Because you kissed me back." He took a step closer. "Felt it clear as day." Margaret's hands clenched in her skirts. "You took me by surprise." "That was the idea." Another step. "Answer the question. Did you want to slap me?" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. "No." Something shifted in his expression. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. Then the walls came up again, and he turned away. "Good. Get yourself settled. I'll see to the animals and then start supper." The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for belonging. Margaret noticed feminine touches, embroidered pillowcases, a quilt in soft blues and greens, a small mirror on the wall, remnants of the first Mrs. Sullivan, she realized with a pang. She changed out of her travel-stained dress into a simple calico work dress, one of only two she owned. Her hands shook as she unpinned her hair and tried to restore some order to the dark waves. In Boston, she'd been considered pretty enough to attract a husband at 18. Now, at 24, she wondered what Thomas saw when he looked at her. A solution to his problems? A warm body to fill an empty house? Or something more? When she emerged, Thomas was at the stove, stirring something in a pot. He'd rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by various scars. Margaret found herself staring at the efficient way he moved, comfortable in what most would consider women's work. "I can do that," she offered. "Sit," he said without turning. "You've been traveling for days. Tomorrow's soon enough to start earning your keep." She bristled at the phrasing, but took a seat at the table. "You cook often?" 3 years now." His voice was matter-of-fact. "Man's got to eat." 3 years, the same length of time she'd been widowed. They were matching bookends of loss. She thought. The meal was simple. Beans and salt pork, biscuits that were surprisingly light, coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of tin plates and the pop of the fire. Margaret searched for something to say, some bridge across the chasm between them, but Thomas seemed content with the quiet. After supper, she insisted on washing up despite his protests. It felt good to do something useful, to establish her place in this strange new household. Thomas sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle with practiced movements. "There's things you need to know," he said suddenly, "about living out here." Margaret dried her hands, turning to face him. "I'm listening. Water's precious. We haul it from the creek a half-mile north. In drought times, we ration. The animals come first. No cattle, no livelihood." He didn't look up from the rifle. "Nearest neighbor's the Parsons, 5 miles east. Town's a day's ride, so we go monthly for supplies. You'll make a list of what's needed." She nodded, filing away the information. "There's a garden plot out back. Sarah kept it going." He stopped abruptly, his hand stilling on the rifle. "Sarah." The first wife's name dropped between them like a stone in still water. "I can tend a garden," Margaret said softly. "Good." He resumed cleaning, movements sharp. There's chickens need feeding, eggs to gather, milk cow too, house needs keeping, meals cooking. It's hard work, harder than what you're used to. You don't know what I'm used to. His eyes flicked up to hers. Boston lady, I can guess. Margaret's temper, held in check all day, finally sparked. Can you guess about 14-hour days in a textile mill? About fingers bleeding from the machinery? About walking home in the dark, hoping the foreman wouldn't follow? About making a week's food money stretched to 10 days? Her voice rose. I didn't come here expecting ease. Mr. Sullivan, I came expecting a chance. Thomas set down the rifle, studying her with new interest. My apologies, he said after a moment. Seems we both made assumptions. The anger drained from her as quickly as it had come. Perhaps we did. That why you answered my advertisement? The foreman? She looked away. Among other reasons. And your husband? Died of scarlet fever 3 years ago, left me with his debts and little else. She met his gaze. And your wife? His jaw tightened. Fever took her too. Her and... He stopped again. That wall slamming down. Fever, he repeated flatly. Her and who? Margaret wondered, but didn't press. They were circling each other like wary animals, revealing only what was necessary. A crack of thunder made them both start. Lightning illuminated the windows, and within moments, rain began pelting the roof. Storm came in fast, Thomas said, rising. I need to check the barn doors. In this weather? He was already reaching for his coat. Can't have the doors blowing open. Stock might panic. Before she could protest further, he was gone, leaving her alone with the drumming rain and dancing shadows. Margaret added wood to the fire, then found herself drawn to the window. She could just make out Thomas's figure struggling through the rising wind, and her heart clenched with unexpected concern. The storm intensified, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack. Margaret paced, wondering if this was to be her life, waiting and worrying while Thomas battled the elements. In Boston, she'd worried about different things, but at least the dangers had been predictable. 20 minutes passed before the door burst open. Thomas stumbling in on a gust of wind and rain. He was soaked through, shivering despite the warmth of the season. Barn secure, he said through chattering teeth. Without thinking, Margaret sprang into action. Get those wet things off, she ordered, grabbing a blanket from the chest by the fireplace. You'll catch your death. He hesitated, then began peeling off his sodden shirt. Margaret politely turned her back, busying herself with heating water for tea, but she couldn't help stealing a glance as he toweled off, noting the scars that marked his back and shoulders. This was a man who'd known violence. She realized, known it and survived it. Thank you, he said when she handed him the tea, wrapped now in the blanket. They sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. The enforced intimacy should have been awkward, but somehow the wild weather made a cocoon of the little house, creating a space outside normal constraints. Why did you really kiss me? Margaret asked suddenly. In town. Thomas was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, been 3 years since I touched a woman with tenderness, when I saw you standing there, looking brave and scared all at once. He shrugged. Couldn't help myself, also couldn't show weakness, not in front of that crowd. So it was strategy? Partly. His eyes found hers across the flickering flames. And partly because I wanted to know. Know what? If you were real. If you'd come all this way just for a business arrangement. Or if there was something more. His voice dropped. Got my answer when you kissed me back. Margaret's breath caught. And what answer was that? That maybe we both came here looking for more than just survival. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Then the fire popped, breaking the spell, and Thomas stood abruptly. Storm's passing, best get some sleep. Tomorrow's a working day. As Margaret lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rain gentle against the roof, she thought about that kiss, about Thomas's scarred hands cradling her face, about the loneliness she tasted on his lips that matched her own. She'd come west for a new start, But perhaps she'd found something else. A man as damaged as herself, holding out the possibility of healing, if they were brave enough to reach for it, if they could learn to trust, if the ghosts of their pasts would let them. Spring in Colorado Territory was a liar. Margaret learned. It promised renewal with warm mornings, only to betray with afternoon winds that cut through cloth like knives. The grass stayed brown and brittle. The creek ran lower each day, and the cattle grew gaunt despite their constant grazing. She'd been at the Sullivan Ranch for 6 weeks now, long enough to establish routines, but not long enough to feel at home. Her hands bore new calluses from hauling water and working the garden plot, trying to coax life from soil that seemed more dust than earth. The chickens had accepted her presence. The milk cow tolerated her inexpert handling. And Thomas remained a mystery. He worked from dawn to well past dusk, riding out to check the herd, mending fences, hauling feed. Some nights he came home so exhausted he could barely eat before collapsing into bed. Other nights he sat by the fire cleaning guns or mending tack, stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. They'd developed a careful dance around each other, polite words over meals, brief touches when he helped her with heavy buckets, moments of unexpected gentleness, like when he'd wordlessly repaired the loose board in the chicken coop that kept catching her skirts. But the raw intensity of that first kiss remained locked away, unexamined and unrepeated. This morning, Margaret woke to find a dead calf in the east pasture. Thomas stood over it, his face grim. "Coyotes?" she asked, though the carcass looked untouched. "Drought," he said flatly. "Mama's milk dried up. Calf was too weak to make it." She watched him dig a hole in the hard ground, his movements mechanical. "How many is that?" "3rd this week, 10th this month." He paused in his digging to wipe sweat from his brow. "At this rate, won't have a herd left by summer's end. Surely the rain will come." He gave her a look that said she was still too green to understand. "Maybe, maybe not. 2 years back, drought lasted 8 months. Lost half the herd. Year before Sarah." He stopped, jaw clenching. Always Sarah. The ghost that stood between them more solid than any wall. That afternoon, while Thomas rode out to move the herd to slightly better grazing, Margaret attacked the garden with renewed determination. If meat would be scarce, they'd need vegetables. She hauled bucket after bucket from the creek, her shoulders screaming protest, sweat soaking through her dress. "Lord have mercy, what are you doing?" Margaret looked up to find a woman watching from beside a rickety wagon. She was perhaps 40, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes beneath a faded bonnet. "I'm watering the garden," Margaret said, straightening with effort. "In this heat, child, you'll kill yourself before you save a single plant." The woman climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility. "I'm Emma Parsons, from the neighboring spread to the east. You must be Thomas's new bride." "Margaret Sullivan." She wiped a dirty hand on her apron before offering it. "Pleased to meet you." Emma's handshake was firm, calloused. "Heard about your arrival. Whole county's been talking about it." Her eyes twinkled. "That was some introduction Thomas gave you at the depot." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. "Yes, well, don't be embarrassed. Most excitement Dry Creek's had in months." Emma studied the struggling garden. "You're going about this wrong. Can't fight the drought head on. Gotta work with it, not against it." For the next hour, Emma shared the wisdom of 20 years on the frontier, how to mulch with dried grass to hold moisture, which plants could survive neglect, how to read the sky for signs of rain that might actually come. Margaret absorbed it all, grateful for both the knowledge and the company. "Thomas seems well," Emma said carefully as they sat in the shade, sharing water from Margaret's bucket. "Better than he's been since Sarah died?" Emma nodded. "You know about her then?" "Only that fever took her. He doesn't talk about it." "No, I don't suppose he would." Emma was quiet for a moment. "It was hard on him, losing her and the baby both." Margaret's heart clenched. A baby. That explained the wall that slammed down whenever he spoke of his late wife. "Still," Emma continued, He's lucky to have you. Place needs a woman's touch. Thomas needs—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "He needs someone who won't break under the weight of this life. From what I see, you might just be strong enough." After Emma left, promising to return next week, Margaret sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon. A dust cloud announced Thomas's return long before she could make out his figure. He rode slumped in the saddle, defeat in every line of his body. "Lost 2 more, he said as he dismounted. "Found them down in a gulch. Must have gone looking for water." Margaret took the reins from his hands. "I'll see to the horse. Go wash up." He looked at her in surprise. She'd never handled his mount before, a rangy bay gelding named Silas who had a reputation for orneriness. But the horse stood quiet as she led him to the barn, perhaps sensing her determination. By the time she returned to the house, Thomas had washed and changed. He sat at the table, staring at nothing. Margaret served the stew she'd kept warm, added fresh biscuits, poured coffee. Then she sat across from him and waited. "We're not going to make it," he said finally. "Not if this drought continues. Bank's already extended the loan twice. Can't pay them with dead cattle. What about selling some of the herd now, before they get weaker?" "Thought of that. So has every other rancher in 3 counties. Price of beef's dropped to nothing. Buyers know we're desperate." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Should have told you before you came. Should have been honest about how bad things were." "Would honesty have changed anything?" Margaret asked. "I still would have come. I had nowhere else to go." He looked up at her then, really looked at her. "You could have found factory work again, or married someone else, someone with better prospects." "I didn't want someone else." The words came out before she could stop them. In the lamplight, she saw his pupils dilate. "Why?" His voice was rough. "Why did you pick my advertisement? There were others." Margaret considered her answer. "Your letter was honest, not trying to paint a pretty picture. You said you needed someone strong. She took a breath. "I needed to be needed, not just wanted for convenience or decoration. Needed." Thomas's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of hers. "You are needed. I mean, more than I expected." The silence stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then, as always, he pulled back. "Emma Parsons came by," Margaret said, allowing the change of subject. "She helped with the garden." "Good. Emma knows this land better than most." He paused. "What did she tell you? About Sarah?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "That you lost a baby too." His face closed off, but this time she pressed forward. "Thomas, I'm your wife, or near enough. If we're to make a life together, I need to understand. Understanding won't change anything." His voice was harsh. "Sarah's dead. The baby's dead. Talking won't bring them back. No, but silence won't let you heal either." He stood abruptly, chair scraping. "I need to check the stock." "You just did. Then I'll check them again." He grabbed his hat and was gone, leaving Margaret alone with the cooling stew and her own frustration. Later that night, she lay awake listening to him pace the main room, back and forth, like a caged animal. The moonlight through her window was bright enough to read by, but she had no heart for her Bible tonight. Instead, she thought about the baby Emma had mentioned, about Sarah, about the weight Thomas carried. A crash from the main room brought her bolt upright. She grabbed her wrapper and hurried out to find Thomas on his knees, picking up pieces of a shattered plate. "Sorry," he muttered. Knocked it off the table. In the moonlight, she could see the wetness on his cheeks. Without thinking, she knelt beside him, stilling his hands. "Leave it," she said softly. "Gotta clean it up. Can't leave a mess." "Thomas, look at me!" He raised his head slowly, and the raw pain in his eyes took her breath away. "It was my fault," he whispered. "Sarah, the baby, if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd recognized the fever earlier. When did it happen?" "Spring, 3 years ago this month." His voice was barely audible. She was so happy about the baby, made plans, sewed little clothes. Then the fever came. Took them both in 2 days. 2 days. And everything I loved was gone. Margaret's heart broke for him. Without conscious thought, she pulled him against her, cradling his head to her shoulder. He resisted for a moment, then crumbled, his body shaking with long-suppressed grief. She held him there on the floor, surrounded by broken pottery, while the moon traced its path across the sky, held him until the shaking stopped and his breathing evened out. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were swollen but clearer. "I'm sorry," he began, but she pressed fingers to his lips. "Don't. You have nothing to apologize for." He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you'd realize what a bad bargain you'd made, a broken-down rancher who couldn't even save his own family." Margaret turned her hand to cup his face. "We're all broken. Thomas, the trick is finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours." He stared at her for a long moment, then leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss entirely different from that first claiming at the depot. This was gentle, questioning, tasting of tears and possibility. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Just stay with me tonight, just to not be alone." She understood. They moved to the rocking chair by the dying fire, and she curled into his lap, her head on his shoulder. He held her like she was precious, like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. As dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Margaret felt something shift between them. The walls were still there, but lower now. The ghosts remained, but perhaps they could learn to live with them. Thomas stirred, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" "For being strong enough to stay when I pushed you away." She smiled against his chest. "I told you I needed to be needed." "You are," he said fiercely. "God help me, you are." Outside, a meadowlark began its morning song. And for the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Margaret felt the stirring of hope. The drought would break, or it wouldn't. The ranch would survive, or it wouldn't. But whatever came, they would face it together. The trouble started on a blazing afternoon in late May when Margaret went to town for supplies. Thomas had wanted to accompany her, but with 3 more cattle down with sickness, he couldn't spare the time. She'd insisted she could manage the wagon alone, after all. She'd been making the trip with him for weeks now. Dry Creek dozed under the merciless sun, its inhabitants seeking whatever shade they could find. Margaret tied the horses outside Fincher's general store and made her way inside, list in hand. She'd grown accustomed to the stares and whispers that followed her, the mail-order bride who'd been kissed before being named. But today felt different. There was an ugliness in the air, thick as the dust. Well, if it ain't Sullivan's bought woman." Margaret's spine stiffened. She knew that voice. Jack Morrison, who owned the spread neighboring Thomas's to the south. He'd been by the ranch twice, ostensibly to discuss water rights, but his eyes had lingered too long on her figure. "Mrs. Sullivan," she corrected coolly, not turning from the shelves. "That's right. I forgot." His boot scraped across the floor as he moved closer. "Tommy boy finally got the preacher out there? Made it all legal and proper?" She could smell the whiskey on him. See the store owner, Mr. Fincher, watching nervously from behind his counter. "The circuit preacher will be through next month," she said, selecting a tin of baking powder with steady hands. "So, not legal yet." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "That means you're fair game, don't it?" "That's enough, Jack." Martha Fincher, the owner's wife, emerged from the back room like an avenging angel. "You got business here. Conduct it. Otherwise, move along." Morrison's face darkened. "Just being neighborly. Martha, wanted to make sure Mrs." He drew out the title mockingly. "Sullivan knows she's got options. That ranch is going under. Everyone can see it. When it does, she'll need somewhere to go. When that time comes, which it won't, I'm certain my husband and I will manage without your assistance, Margaret said, turning to face him fully. His bloodshot eyes traveled down her body with deliberate slowness. Your husband, the man who couldn't keep his first wife alive. You sure you want to pin your hopes on him? The words hit like a physical blow, but Margaret kept her expression neutral. My hopes and where I pin them are none of your concern, Mr. Morrison. Maybe not yet. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the broken veins in his nose, the cruel twist of his mouth. But when Sullivan loses that ranch, and he will, you remember Jack Morrison made you an offer? I could use a woman with spirit around my place? Course, I'd want to sample the goods first. Make sure you're worth the trouble. Get out. Martha Fincher's voice could have frozen hellfire. Get out of my store before I get my husband's shotgun. Morrison laughed, but backed toward the door. Think about it, sweetheart. Could save yourself a lot of hardship. His eyes found Margaret's one last time. Tommy Sullivan brings death to everything he touches. His parents, his wife, his baby, his ranch. You'd be smart to get out while you can. After he left, Margaret stood trembling with rage and something else. Fear. Not of Morrison himself, but of the doubts he'd planted. Don't pay him no mind, Martha said gently. Jack Morrison's been a snake since the day he was born. Been trying to get his hands on the Sullivan spread for years. Is it true? Margaret asked quietly. About Thomas's parents? Martha's hesitation was answer enough. Fire, she said finally. 10 years back. Thomas was out with the herd when it happened. Nothing he could have done. But, well, some folks like to add up coincidences and call them curses. Margaret finished her shopping in silence, her mind churning. As she loaded the wagon, she noticed Morrison lounging against the saloon across the street, watching her with predatory patience. She'd dealt with his type before, men who saw women as possessions to be acquired, willing or not. But out here, with the law a day's ride away and might making right, the danger felt more immediate. The ride home seemed longer than usual, every shadow potentially hiding threats. When the ranch finally came into view, Margaret nearly wept with relief. Thomas emerged from the barn as she pulled up, and the worry in his eyes told her he'd been watching for her. You're late, he said, helping her down. Everything all right? Fine, she lied. Town was busy. He studied her face, not fooled. Margaret, what happened? She busied herself with unhitching the horses. Jack Morrison was in town. He made some suggestions about my future. Thomas went very still. What kind of suggestions? The kind a married woman shouldn't have to hear. She faced him, seeing the storm building in his eyes. Thomas, no, he's not worth... He put his hands on you. No, just words. Ugly ones. But still just words. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. I should have gone with you. You had work here. I can't hide behind you every time someone says something unpleasant. Morrison's more than unpleasant. He's dangerous. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. He's wanted this land for years. Tried to buy it after Sarah. When I refused, he started making trouble. Fences cut, water holes poisoned. Could never prove it was him. He mentioned your parents, Margaret said quietly. Thomas flinched. Of course he did. Man collects other people's pain like some collect coins. He took the reins from her hands. What else? She didn't want to tell him, but secrets had no place between them now. He said you bring death to everything you touch. The words hung in the air like a curse. Thomas's face went white, then red, his hands clenching into fists. Thomas, he's right. The words came out raw. My parents, Sarah, the baby. Now the ranch is dying too. Maybe you should... Don't... Margaret grabbed his arm. Don't you dare tell me I should leave. I knew what I was choosing when I came here. I'm not some fragile flower to wilt at the first harsh wind. You don't understand. Morrison, he doesn't make idle threats. If he's set his sights on you, then we'll face him together. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I've dealt with men like Jack Morrison before. They're bullies and cowards, preying on those they see as weak. We're not weak. Thomas, not apart, and certainly not together. He covered her hands with his calluses rough against her skin. I can't lose you too, he whispered. I can't. You won't. She pulled him down for a kiss, fierce and promising. I'm too stubborn to die on you. That night over supper, they made plans. Thomas would teach her to shoot, really shoot. Not just the basic lessons he'd given her for dealing with snakes and coyotes. They'd vary their trips to town, never establishing a predictable pattern, and they'd be ready for whatever Morrison might try. But Morrison was cleverer than they anticipated. He didn't come himself. Instead, 2 days later, Margaret found her vegetable garden trampled, the plants she'd coaxed to life crushed into the dirt. The next week, their best milk cow was found dead. No marks on her, but foam at her mouth suggesting poison. Could be natural causes, Thomas said, but they both knew better. The campaign of harassment continued. Cut fences that let the remaining cattle wander. A fire set in the grassland that Thomas barely managed to contain. Dead animals left where Margaret would find them. Coyotes and rabbits arranged in grotesque displays. Through it all, they endured, but the strain showed. Thomas grew gaunt from staying up nights to guard the property. Margaret jumped at shadows, kept a rifle close even when doing chores. The drought continued its merciless assault, and their resources dwindled with each passing day. The breaking point came on a still afternoon when Thomas was out checking the far pastures. Margaret was alone at the house, mending harnesses on the porch. When she heard horses approaching, her hand went immediately to the rifle beside her chair. 3 riders appeared. Morrison flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. Hard cases by the look of them, with tied-down guns and cold eyes. Afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan. Morrison touched his hat mockingly. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're faring. State your business or move along. Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Now, is that any way to treat neighbors? Morrison dismounted, his companions following suit. Just came to make you another offer. Things are getting mighty hard for you and Sullivan. I'm prepared to buy you out, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. He moved closer to the porch. I'm being generous here. Could just wait for the bank to foreclose, buy it cheap at auction. But I'm willing to pay fair value now. Save you folks the embarrassment. How generous, Margaret said dryly. And I suppose this has nothing to do with the dead cattle and cut fences. Morrison's smile was sharp. Don't know what you're talking about. Lots of troubles on the range these days. Drought makes animals do strange things. Men, too. One of his companions had circled around toward the side of the house. Margaret shifted the rifle, making sure they saw she was watching. Where's Sullivan? Morrison asked. Hate to discuss business without the man of the house present. He'll be back soon. Will he? Morrison stepped onto the first porch step. Or is he out chasing scattered cattle through cut fences? Might be gone for hours. Fear clawed at Margaret's throat, but she pushed it down. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Morrison? Just that a woman alone out here, well, accidents happen. Be a shame if something occurred before your husband got back. Course, if you were more friendly-like, my boys and I might be persuaded to help protect the place. Margaret stood slowly, the rifle trained on Morrison's chest. Mr. Morrison, you have 10 seconds to get off our property. He laughed. You going to shoot all 3 of us, little lady? No. She cocked the rifle. Just you. I figure your hired men won't be so eager to die for wages. The 2 hard cases exchanged glances. Morrison's face flushed dark red. You're making a mistake, he snarled. When this place goes under, 9 seconds. Sullivan can't protect you forever. 8. This isn't over. 7. Morrison backed off the step, hands raised in mock surrender. All right. We're going. He mounted his horse with jerky movements. But you remember this day. Remember you had a chance to do this easy. They rode off in a cloud of dust. But Margaret didn't lower the rifle until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to sink into the chair, shaking like a leaf in a storm. That's how Thomas found her an hour later, still clutching the rifle with white knuckles. "Margaret," he was off his horse and beside her in seconds. "What happened?" She told him everything, watching his face grow darker with each word. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe. "I should have been here," he said against her hair. "You can't be everywhere at once." She pulled back to look at him. "But Thomas, he's not going to stop. He wants this land, and he wants—" She couldn't finish. "I know what he wants." Thomas's voice was deadly quiet, and he's never going to get it. Either of it. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The rifle lay across Thomas's lap, and Margaret had her derringer within reach. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered that advertisement in Boston, but somehow, despite the danger and hardship, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Are you sorry?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Sorry you came." Margaret considered the question, thinking of her small room in Boston, the grinding sameness of factory work, the hopelessness that had driven her west. Then she looked at the man beside her, worn down by loss and worry, but still fighting, still standing. "No," she said simply. "Never." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "We'll get through this, Morrison, the drought, all of it. We'll survive." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. Together. Together. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to carry all the loneliness and danger of the frontier. But here on the porch, in the circle of light from their lamp, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Safe, not from physical danger that would always exist out here, but safe in the knowledge that she was no longer alone, that someone would stand beside her against whatever came, even if what came was Jack Morrison and all the darkness he represented. The nightmare started 3 days after Morrison's visit. Margaret would wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, reaching for Thomas in the darkness. Sometimes she dreamed of rough hands dragging her from the house. Other times, she saw Thomas lying still in the dust, Morrison standing over him with a smoking gun. Each time, Thomas would hold her until the shaking stopped, whispering reassurances neither quite believed. The days blurred together in a haze of vigilance and exhaustion. They took turns keeping watch, one always awake while the other tried to rest. The ranch work suffered, but survival took precedence over prosperity. Thomas taught her to shoot with deadly accuracy, setting up targets behind the barn. The kick of the rifle bruised her shoulder, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was learning to fight back. "Aim for the chest," Thomas instructed, adjusting her stance. "Bigger target than the head, and if Morrison or his men come—" "I know," Margaret interrupted. "Don't hesitate." He studied her face, perhaps seeing the steel that factory life and widowhood had forged. "You've killed before." "No." She sighted down the barrel. "But I've wanted to." The rifle cracked, and the tin can flew off the fence post. Thomas nodded approval, but she saw the shadow in his eyes. He was changing her. This life was changing her, and they both knew it. A week passed without incident, then another. The waiting scraped at their nerves like sandpaper. Margaret found herself jumping at every sound, the creak of the windmill, the distant bawl of cattle, the whisper of wind through dry grass. She knew Morrison was out there, planning, and the anticipation was almost worse than an actual attack. The first real test came on a sweltering afternoon. Margaret was drawing water from the well when she heard horses approaching fast. Her rifle was in the house, too far, but the derringer Thomas had given her was tucked in her apron pocket. 3 riders burst into the yard, but these weren't Morrison's men. It was Sam Edwards, a neighboring rancher, with his 2 sons. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Sam pulled up hard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Where's Thomas?" "North pasture." Margaret's heart hammered. What's wrong? Prairie fire, moving this way fast. Started on Morrison's land, but the wind's pushing it north. We're gathering everyone to cut a fire break, but we need every hand. Margaret didn't hesitate. I'll get him. She saddled her mare with shaking hands. Prairie fire. It could destroy everything in hours, reduce their struggling ranch to ash and char. As she rode hard toward the north pasture, she couldn't shake the timing. A fire starting on Morrison's land, with the wind just right to push it toward them. She found Thomas already heading back, smoke visible on the southern horizon like a dark wall. I know, he said before she could speak. Saw the smoke, Morrison? Maybe, but Sam Edwards is gathering men for a fire break. We need to go. They rode back together, and Thomas quickly organized their response. While he joined the line of men heading to fight the fire, Margaret worked with the other women to move what stock they could to the safest areas, soak down the buildings, and prepare for the worst. The next hours blurred into a hellish dance of smoke and flame. Margaret had never seen anything like it. A wall of fire 30 feet high, devouring the dry prairie grass with terrifying hunger. The men worked frantically to clear a strip of land ahead of it, burning the grass in a controlled way to rob the main fire of fuel. Through the chaos, she spotted Morrison among the firefighters, working alongside everyone else with apparent dedication. It was a clever alibi. Who could accuse him of setting a fire he was helping to fight? As darkness fell, the wind shifted. What had been pushing the fire toward the Sullivan Ranch suddenly turned it east, toward the Edwards spread. Margaret heard the shouts of alarm, saw men racing to establish a new fire break. In the confusion, she lost sight of Thomas. That's when Morrison appeared at her elbow. Dangerous night, he said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather at a church social. Easy for accidents to happen. Man could fall off his horse, get trampled in the dark, or maybe get caught on the wrong side of a fire break. If anything happens to my husband, Margaret began. Now. Morrison's teeth gleamed in the firelight. I'm just observing how dangerous these situations can be. Course, if you were to reconsider my offer, I'd make sure Thomas stayed safe tonight. My men are out there too, after all. Be a shame if they mistook him for a threat in all this smoke. Margaret felt for the derringer in her pocket. Around them, people rushed back and forth, too focused on the fire to pay attention to one conversation. You'd murder a man fighting to save everyone's land. Murder's a strong word. Accident, though, he shrugged. Like I said, easy for things to go wrong on a night like this. And if I agreed, what exactly would you want? His eyes glittered with triumph. Smart woman. Here's the deal. You convince Sullivan to sell at my price tonight. Papers all legal and proper. You two can leave in the morning. Start fresh somewhere else. And if Thomas refuses, then you'd be a widow twice over, wouldn't you? Course, I'd be there to comfort you in your grief. Might even let you stay on at the ranch, in a different capacity. Bile rose in Margaret's throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. I need to find Thomas, to talk to him. You do that, but remember, accidents happen fast out here. Margaret moved through the chaos, searching desperately for Thomas. She found him finally, covered in soot and ash, helping to beat out spot fires with wet burlap. Thomas! She pulled him aside, speaking urgently in his ear over the roar of flames. His face went dark as death as she repeated Morrison's threats. Where is he? Thomas, no, that's what he wants, for you to attack him in front of witnesses. We need to be smart. Smart? He gripped her shoulders. The man threatened to kill me, threatened you, and we're going to stop him. She met his eyes fiercely, but not by playing into his hands. Before Thomas could respond, a shout went up. The firebreak was holding, the main blaze turning back on itself for lack of fuel. Men began to cheer, but Margaret felt no relief. The real danger was still out there in human form. As the crowd began to disperse, exhausted firefighters heading home, Morrison approached them with two of his men. Sullivan, he called out. Your wife and I had an interesting conversation about the future of your ranch. Thomas stepped in front of Margaret. Whatever you have to say it to me. Just trying to be helpful. Offer still stands. Fair price for your land. Enough to start over clean. Morrison's smile was predatory. Better than losing everything to drought, or fire, or other misfortunes. Get off my land, Thomas said quietly. Public gathering, fighting fire. Not your land right here. Morrison's hand rested casually on his gun. But I'll be going. You folks think about my offer. Think hard. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen while you're thinking. As they rode away, one of Morrison's men looked back, drawing his finger across his throat in an unmistakable gesture. That night, Margaret and Thomas sat in their kitchen, the smell of smoke clinging to everything. The fire was controlled, their ranch spared, but the threat remained. We can't go on like this, Margaret said. He'll keep escalating until... I know. Thomas stared at his hands. Part of me wants to ride over there tonight. Settle this man to man. That's what he wants. You'd be the aggressor. He'd have every right to defend himself, and with his hired guns. So what do? Run? Let him win? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then, what if we didn't run, but we didn't fight either? At least not the way he expects. What do you mean? Morrison's used to dealing with men like himself. Direct, violent. But what if we fought smarter? Emma Parsons mentioned the Cattlemen's Association meeting next month. All the ranchers gather, including the bank representatives. What if we presented our case there, publicly? Made it clear what Morrison's been doing? Thomas shook his head. No proof. It would be our word against his. Maybe, but others might have stories too. And if we make enough noise, raise enough questions. She leaned forward. Morrison relies on fear and isolation. But we're not isolated. We have neighbors, friends, Emma Parsons, Sam Edwards, others who've probably faced his tactics. It's dangerous. Corner a snake, and it strikes. Then we'd better be ready when it does. They talked until dawn, planning and preparing. It was a slim hope, but it was better than waiting for Morrison to make good on his threats. As the first light touched the eastern sky, Thomas pulled her close. You're braver than any woman I've known, he said softly. Not brave. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of smoke and sweat and safety. Just too stubborn to let evil win. Margaret, he tilted her chin up. If something happens to me, nothing will happen. She kissed him fiercely. Because we're going to win this. Together. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret felt the shadow of Morrison's threat hanging over them. The fire had been just the beginning. The real battle was still to come, and she knew with cold certainty that before it was over, blood would water the dry Colorado earth. The question was whose blood it would be. That morning, as Thomas rode out to check the fire damage, Margaret stood on the porch with her rifle, watching the horizon. Somewhere out there, Jack Morrison was planning his next move, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the mail-order bride from Boston. She'd survived factory work, widowhood, and starting over in a harsh new land. She'd found love in the most unlikely place, with a man as damaged as herself, and she'd be damned if she'd let Jack Morrison take any of it away. The war wasn't over, but Margaret Sullivan was ready to fight. The attack came at dawn, 2 weeks after the fire. Margaret woke to the thunder of hooves and the crash of breaking wood. She grabbed the rifle beside the bed, her heart hammering as Thomas bolted upright. How many? She asked, already knowing this was no ordinary raid. Through the window, they could see at least 8 riders tearing through their property, whooping and firing guns into the air. But these weren't Morrison's usual men. These were professionals, faces masked with bandanas, movements coordinated and purposeful. Stay inside, Thomas commanded, pulling on his boots and checking his pistol. Like hell. Margaret was already loading extra shells into her apron pockets. They took positions at different windows, the house becoming their fortress. The raiders had scattered the remaining cattle, torn down sections of fence, and now circled the house like wolves. Sullivan, a voice called out. Not Morrison's, but one of his hired guns. Come out and face justice. You've been accused of rustling Morrison cattle." "Rustling?" Thomas shouted back. "That's rich, coming from thieves and murderers." The response was a volley of gunfire that shattered the front windows. Margaret dropped below the sill, glass raining down on her. When she rose to return fire, she saw two men trying to set fire to the barn. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as she fired, and one of the men spun and fell. The other abandoned his torch and dove for cover. First blood drawn, and God help her, she felt no remorse. "Good shot," Thomas called from across the room. Then his own gun barked as riders charged the house. What followed was a nightmare of smoke and noise. Margaret lost count of how many times she reloaded, firing at anything that moved. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick. Her ears rang from the constant gunfire. But she kept shooting. Thomas was magnificent, calm and deadly, placing his shots with terrible precision. Two more raiders fell, and suddenly the enthusiasm for the attack waned. The remaining men pulled back, taking positions behind the overturned wagon and the well housing. "We can wait you out! Sullivan!" the leader called. "No water in this heat. You won't last long." He was right. In the chaos, Margaret realized they hadn't filled the water buckets the night before. They had perhaps half a day before thirst became desperate. "Thomas," she whispered, "the root cellar." He understood immediately. When they'd strengthened the house defenses, they'd also stocked the root cellar with emergency supplies, including water, but to reach it meant crossing 10 feet of open ground. "Cover me," he said. "No, I'm smaller, faster. You're the better shot." Before he could protest, she was moving. Thomas's rifle cracked steadily, keeping the raiders' heads down as Margaret sprinted for the cellar doors. Bullets whined past her, splintering wood, but she made it, tumbling down the earthen steps. The cellar was cool and dark, and for a moment she simply breathed. Then she gathered what they needed: water, ammunition, the small box of medical supplies. As she prepared to make the return dash, she heard something that made her blood freeze. More horses approaching. Many more. This was it. Then, Morrison had brought an army. They couldn't fight off this many. Margaret gripped her derringer, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. "Save the last bullet for yourself. Don't let them take you alive." But the new gunfire wasn't directed at the house. Shouts of alarm came from the raiders, and the shooting became chaotic, confused. Margaret risked a look and nearly cried with relief. Sam Edwards and his sons, the Parsons brothers, even old Miguel from the Mexican settlement, at least a dozen men, riding hard and shooting straight. The cavalry had arrived. The tide turned quickly. Caught between the house and the rescue party, the raiders scattered. Two tried to flee across the open prairie but were ridden down. Others threw down their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Margaret emerged from the cellar to find Thomas in the yard, his gun trained on the captured leader. Blood seeped from a graze on Thomas's temple, but he stood steady. "Take off the mask," he ordered. The man complied, revealing a scarred face Margaret didn't recognize. A hired gun from Kansas. They learned later. Brought in special for this massacre. "Where's Morrison?" Thomas demanded. The man spat in the dirt. "Don't know any Morrison. You're lying." Sam Edwards dismounted, his usually kind face hard with anger. "We know Morrison hired you, just like we know he's been terrorizing folks all over the county. Prove it." The gunman sneered. That's when Emma Parsons rode up, and she wasn't alone. Beside her, white-faced and trembling, sat Jack Morrison's own foreman, Pete Hensley. "Tell them," Emma commanded. "Tell them what you told me." Hensley looked at the captured raiders, at the dead men sprawled in the dust, and something broke in his expression. "Morrison hired them," he said hoarsely. "Hired them to kill the Sullivans and make it look like rustlers. Said with them gone, he could buy the ranch cheap from the bank." "You'll testify to that?" Thomas asked. Hensley nodded miserably. "I've had enough. The things I've done, the things I've seen. Morrison's got to be stopped." While the men secured the prisoners and tended the wounded, Emma pulled Margaret aside. "You all right, child?" Margaret looked down at herself, dress torn, face streaked with powder residue. hands still shaking slightly. "I shot a man," she said quietly. "Maybe killed him. To save your home and your husband." Emma's voice was firm. "That's no sin in my book." As the sun climbed higher, more neighbors arrived. Word had spread fast about the attack, and the community's response was overwhelming. Men who'd barely spoken to Thomas since Sarah's death now clapped him on the shoulder, offering support. "Should have done this years ago," Sam Edwards said. "Let Morrison run roughshod too long, but attacking you folks in broad daylight, trying to massacre you, that's too far, even for him." They formed a makeshift posse, 30 men strong. Thomas wanted Margaret to stay behind with the women, but she refused. "This is my fight too," she said. "I've earned the right to see it finished." He didn't argue, perhaps recognizing the steel in her voice. She'd been transformed by the morning's violence, baptized in gunfire and blood. The Boston factory girl was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The ride to Morrison's ranch was tense, weapons at the ready, but they found the place nearly deserted. Morrison had fled, taking his most loyal men and what money he could grab. The remaining ranch hands, seeing which way the wind blew, offered no resistance. In Morrison's office, they found evidence of his crimes, ledgers detailing bribes and threats, plans for taking over neighboring ranches, even correspondence with the hired killers. It was enough to see him hanged if he was caught. "He's probably halfway to Mexico by now," someone said. But Thomas studied the abandoned desk, noting what was missing. "No." His pride won't let him run far. He'll be back. As they rode home, Margaret felt the adrenaline draining away, leaving her exhausted and shaky. The ranch, when they reached it, looked like a battlefield. Dead horses, scattered debris, bullet holes pocking every surface. But it was still standing. They were still alive. That night, neighbors pitched in to clean up and stand guard. Women brought food. Men helped repair the worst damage. It was a community coming together, united by shared outrage and common purpose. Margaret found herself beside the grave Thomas had dug for the man she'd shot. He'd been young, maybe 20, with a wanted poster in his pocket from Nebraska. A killer for hire, but still a human being whose life she'd ended. "The first is always the hardest," Emma said, joining her. "But you did what you had to do." "I know." Margaret touched her stomach, where a new secret grew. She hadn't told Thomas yet about the life quickening inside her, hadn't wanted to add to his worries, but after today, she wondered what kind of world she was bringing a child into. Thomas appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. "You were incredible today," he murmured. "A warrior woman. I was terrified. So was I, but we survived. Together." As they stood there in the gathering darkness, a rider approached fast from the south. Everyone tensed, weapons appearing in hands, but it was one of the Mexican vaqueros from the settlement. "Senor Sullivan," he called. "Morrison, he's at the old mission, wounded. One of your shots found him as he fled. He's asking for Priest, but also—" The vaquero hesitated. "He's asking for you." Thomas and Margaret exchanged looks. It could be a trap, one final attempt to kill them, but it could also be the ending they needed. "How many men with him?" Thomas asked. "None, senor. He is alone, dying." The posse mounted up again, riding hard for the abandoned mission 5 miles south. They found Morrison where the vaquero said, propped against the crumbling adobe wall, his shirt dark with blood. He looked up as they approached, his face gray with pain and loss. "Sullivan," he wheezed. "Didn't expect to see you again." Disappointed, Thomas kept his gun drawn. Morrison tried to laugh, but coughed blood instead. Maybe relieved. His eyes found Margaret. You shot me during the raid. Lucky shot through the window." Margaret felt no satisfaction, only a weary sadness. "You brought it on yourself." "True enough." Morrison's breathing grew labored. Wanted that land so bad. Reminded me of home, before the war took everything. Thought if I could just have that piece of earth." I could start over. Be someone respectable again. You could have bought land honestly, Thomas said. Built something instead of trying to steal it. Too late. For could-haves. Morrison's eyes were glazing. Sullivan, your first wife, Sarah, want you to know, I had nothing to do with her death. That was just cruel gossip. I'm a bastard, but not that much of one. Thomas's gun hand trembled slightly. Margaret saw years of suspicion and hate warring with this deathbed confession. The baby too? Thomas asked hoarsely. Fever took them. Nothing more. I swear it. On my own death. Morrison coughed again, weaker now. The parents, though, the fire, that was... But whatever confession he might have made died with him. Jack Morrison slumped forward, his reign of terror ending in blood and dust at a ruined mission. They buried him there. No word said over the grave. The threat was ended. But Margaret felt no joy. Too much had been lost. Too much pain caused for one man's twisted dream of redemption. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Thomas reached over to take her hand. It's finished, he said. Yes. Margaret squeezed his fingers. Now we can begin. She thought of the life growing inside her, of the ranch that would need rebuilding, of the community that had rallied to save them. The drought would end eventually. The cattle would return. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something good from all this sorrow. The mail-order bride from Boston had found her place at last, written in gunpowder and sealed in blood, but hers nonetheless, and as the ranch house came into view, lamplight glowing warm in the windows where neighbors kept watch, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The worst was over. Now came the living. The fever came for Thomas 3 days after Morrison's death. Margaret found him collapsed by the well at dawn, his skin burning, the graze on his temple angry and infected. With Sam Edwards's help, she got him into bed, but her heart sank at his labored breathing, the way he didn't recognize her. Blood poisoning, Doc Hawkins said when he finally arrived from town. He was a competent man, but his grim expression told Margaret everything. That head wound went bad. Should have been cleaned proper right after the fight. We were busy surviving, Margaret said sharply. Can you help him? I'll do what I can, but ma'am, he met her eyes. You should prepare yourself. I've seen strong men taken by less. Margaret's hands clenched. She'd lost one husband to fever. She would not lose another. For 2 days and nights, she never left Thomas's side. She bathed his burning skin with cool cloths, forced water between his cracked lips, held him when delirium made him call for Sarah and the baby. The neighbors helped as they could. Emma bringing food Margaret couldn't eat, Sam tending the animals, others standing guard in case any of Morrison's scattered men sought revenge. On the second night, Thomas's fever spiked dangerously. He thrashed in the bed, fighting invisible enemies, crying out words that broke Margaret's heart. My fault, he muttered. Should have been there. Should have saved them. Shh, Margaret soothed, holding his hand. It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. His eyes opened, focusing on her with desperate clarity. Margaret, I'm here. If I don't... He struggled to speak. If I don't make it, you will. She gripped his hand tighter. You have to, because I need you. We need you. Something in her tone made him study her face. We? She placed his hand on her still flat belly. We... Wonder flickered in his fevered eyes. A baby? Yes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. So you see, Thomas Sullivan, you don't get to die. You have to live, for both of us. He managed a weak smile. Bossy woman. You knew that when you kissed me at the depot? Best decision I ever made. His eyes drifted closed. Love you, Margaret. Should have said it sooner. Then live so you can say it every day. Through that endless night, she talked to him. Told him about the future they'd build. The children who'd run through the house. The cattle that would grow fat when the rains returned. The garden that would bloom. She painted pictures with words. willing him to fight for that future. As dawn broke, the fever finally began to ease. Thomas's breathing deepened. His skin cooled. Doc Hawkins, who'd returned to check on them, declared it a miracle. "Seen men half his age succumb to blood poisoning," he said, shaking his head. "He must have something powerful to live for." Margaret smoothed Thomas's hair back from his forehead. "He does." Thomas woke properly near sunset, weak but lucid. His first word was her name. "I'm here," she assured him, helping him sip water. "The baby... was that real?" "Very real." She managed a watery smile. "Due in winter, I think." He reached up to touch her face with a shaking hand. "Margaret Sullivan, you are full of surprises. Good ones, I hope." "The best." He caught her hand. "I meant what I said. In the fever. I love you." "I know." She kissed his palm. "I love you too, even though I brought you to this." He gestured weakly at their bullet-riddled home. "Especially because you brought me to this." She settled beside him on the bed, careful of his weakness. "Thomas, I need to tell you something. That first day, when you kissed me at the depot, I was terrified. Not of you, but of what I felt. I'd resigned myself to a business arrangement, a practical solution to both our problems. I wasn't prepared for passion. Neither was I," he admitted. "When I saw you step off that stage, looking brave and beautiful and absolutely terrified, something inside me just knew. You were what I'd been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting." They lay together in comfortable silence as twilight painted the room purple and gold. Outside, she could hear Sam Edwards talking with the men on guard duty. The ranch was safe. For now. "We need to talk about the future," Thomas said eventually. "The ranch is in bad shape. We lost most of the herd. The fences are destroyed, and we still owe the bank." "The Cattlemen's Association meeting is next week," Margaret interrupted. "With Morrison gone and Hensley willing to testify about his crimes, we might be able to make a case for damages, get compensation for what he destroyed." Thomas looked at her with new respect. "When did you become such a strategist? Somewhere between loading rifles and shooting outlaws, I suppose." He laughed, then winced as it pulled at his wounds. "We make a good team. The best." As Thomas recovered, the community rallied around them in ways that would have seemed impossible months before. Morrison's reign of terror had affected many, and his death freed them to speak up. At the Cattlemen's Association meeting, rancher after rancher stood to testify about cut fences, poisoned water holes, threatened families. Hensley's testimony was damning. He detailed years of Morrison's schemes, including the fund Morrison had built up through extortion and cattle rustling. The association voted unanimously to liquidate Morrison's assets and distribute them among his victims. "It won't make you rich," the bank representative warned Thomas and Margaret, "but it should cover your debts and give you enough to rebuild." It was more than they dared hope for. With the financial pressure eased, they could focus on restoration rather than mere survival. The work was hard but hopeful. Neighbors pitched in to rebuild fences and repair the house. Thomas, still weak from his ordeal, supervised while Margaret and others did the heavy labor. She'd never been stronger, the pregnancy giving her a fierce energy. 3 weeks after the attack, the circuit preacher finally arrived. The wedding was simple. Margaret, in her best dress, carefully mended where bullets had torn it. Thomas, still pale but standing straight. The whole community gathered to witness. "Do you, Thomas Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher intoned. "I do." Thomas's voice was strong, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face, again and always. "And do you—" "Margaret Sullivan. Actually," Margaret interrupted, causing a stir. "I've been Margaret Sullivan since the day I arrived. This is just making official what's been true all along." The preacher, flustered, consulted his book. "Well, that is, just say, 'I do, woman,'" Emma Parsons called out, causing laughter to ripple through the crowd. "I do," Margaret said, grinning. "With all my heart." when the preacher pronounced them man and wife. Thomas kissed her with the same intensity as that first day at the depot, but this time with tenderness rather than desperation. The crowd cheered, and Margaret thought she'd never been happier. The wedding feast was held outdoors, tables groaning with food the neighbor women had prepared. As the sun set, someone brought out a fiddle, and dancing began. Margaret watched Thomas carefully turn Emma Parsons through a slow waltz, still favoring his strength. "He looks happy," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Sam Edwards, a cup of punch in each weathered hand. "He is happy," she said, accepting the drink gratefully. "We both are. You've earned it, both of you, after everything." He shook his head. "Sarah would be glad, you know. She wouldn't have wanted Thomas to grieve forever. Did you know her well?" "Well enough, sweet woman, but delicate. This life was hard on her. She tried. Lord knows she tried. But she was a town girl at heart, never quite adapted to the frontier." He studied Margaret. "You're different. You're steel-wrapped in silk." Margaret laughed. "I think the silk wore off somewhere between Boston and here." "No," Sam said thoughtfully. "It's still there. Just makes the steel more surprising." As if summoned by the conversation about strength, Thomas appeared at her elbow. "May I have this dance? Mrs. Sullivan? You should be resting. I've been resting for weeks. One dance won't kill me." He pulled her into his arms as the fiddle began a sweet, slow melody. "Besides, I want everyone to see how lucky I am." They swayed together under the stars, careful of his healing body and her changing one. Around them, their neighbors and friends celebrated not just a wedding, but a victory over fear and isolation. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly. Margaret thought of the violence she'd witnessed and participated in, the hardships still to come, the uncertain future stretching ahead. Then she thought of the life growing inside her, the man holding her close, the community that had become family. "No regrets," she said firmly. "This is where I belong." He spun her gently, making her laugh. "That first letter you sent," he said, "you wrote that you were seeking a new beginning and willing to work for it. Did you imagine it would be like this?" "Honestly, I imagined cooking and cleaning and keeping lonely company with a grieving widower. I didn't imagine gunfights and prairie fires and falling in love." "Disappointed?" She stretched up to kiss him. "Never." The party continued late into the night, but eventually, the guests departed with good wishes and promises to help with the continued rebuilding. Margaret and Thomas stood on their porch, watching the last wagon disappear into the darkness. "Home," Thomas said, the word carrying weight. "Home." Margaret agreed. Inside. The bullet holes had been patched, new glass gleamed in the windows, and fresh curtains, a wedding gift from Emma, hung straight and clean. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. As they prepared for bed, their first night as officially married, Margaret caught Thomas staring at her with an odd expression. "What is it?" "I was just thinking about that day at the depot, how I kissed you before saying your name." He pulled her close. "I knew your name, of course, had been saying it to myself for weeks, wondering what you'd be like. But when I saw you, when I kissed you, your name didn't matter. You were just mine. Does that make sense?" Margaret wound her arms around his neck. "Perfect sense, because I was yours, from that first moment, even when I was angry about it, even when I was scared. I was yours. And now I'm yours by choice, not chance. Yours by love, not law. Yours because I can't imagine being anyone else's." He kissed her then with all the gentleness he'd learned and all the passion that had never dimmed. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, but inside their small fortress of wood and stone and love, Margaret and Thomas Sullivan began their true life together. The mail-order bride had found her home at last, and the rancher had found his heart. Autumn arrived like a blessing, bringing the first real rain in months. Margaret stood on the porch, letting the drops fall on her upturned face while Thomas laughed at her joy. Her belly had grown round with their child, and the ranch had been transformed from a place of mere survival to a true home. The cattle were returning, slowly, in small numbers, but returning nonetheless. With Morrison's compensation and careful management, they'd purchased hardy stock from Texas, animals bred to withstand drought and hardship. The garden flourished under Margaret's care, and even the chickens seemed to lay with more enthusiasm. "Never thought I'd see you dancing in the rain," Thomas said, pulling her against him, his hands protective over her swollen middle. "Never thought I'd have reason to," she replied, then gasped as the baby kicked. "Oh, feel that?" Thomas's face lit with wonder as he felt the movement. Strong already, like his mother. Or her mother, Margaret corrected. "This one fights like a girl, smart and strategic." They stood together watching the rain transform their land. Brown grass already showing hints of green. It had been 6 months since that desperate morning when outlaws attacked their home. 6 months of rebuilding and healing and growing closer. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what you said that night, about broken pieces fitting together." "What about it?" He turned her to face him, his gray eyes serious. "We never did things the proper way, did we? Met through letters, kissed before talking, married while fighting for our lives." "I wouldn't change any of it," Margaret said firmly. "Neither would I, but now, with the baby coming, with the ranch recovering," he took a breath. "I want to do something right, something just for us." That evening, he led her to the hill overlooking their property. Someone, she suspected Emma Parsons, had helped him arrange a small table there, set with their best dishes and wildflowers in a mason jar. The setting sun painted everything golden, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas Sullivan, are you courting me?" "Trying to." He pulled out her chair with exaggerated formality. "Figured it was about time I treated you like the lady you are, instead of the partner in crime you've had to be." They dined on simple fare made special by the setting and the company. Thomas told her stories of his childhood she'd never heard, and she shared memories of Boston before the hardship. They talked of dreams for their child, plans for the ranch, hopes for the future that no longer seemed impossible. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Thomas stood and offered his hand. "Dance with me? There's no music. Don't need any." They swayed together on the hilltop, her belly pressed between them, the baby quiet, as if listening. Thomas hummed something low and sweet, a lullaby his mother had sung. He said. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself be held, feeling safer than she'd ever imagined possible. "I have something for you," he said eventually, producing a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver locket, simple but beautiful. Margaret opened it to find a tiny photograph. Thomas, looking younger and less careworn, attempting a serious expression that didn't quite hide the smile in his eyes. "When did you—" "Had it taken in town last week, while you were terrorizing the general store owner about the price of flour." He fastened it around her neck. "Wanted you to have something nice, something that wasn't about survival or necessity, just something beautiful, like you." Margaret kissed him through her tears. "I love it. I love you." "Even though I did everything backwards? Kissed you first, courted you last?" She laughed, the sound carrying across their land. "Especially because of that. We wrote our own story. Thomas, no one else's rules, just ours." They made their way back to the house as the moon rose, walking slowly to accommodate her condition. The ranch spread before them, not grand, but solid. Theirs, inside, as Margaret prepared for bed. She caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the frightened widow who'd stepped off the stage in Dry Creek. This woman was strong, confident, marked by sun and wind and triumph. She wore her simple dress like armor and her pregnancy like a crown. "You're beautiful," Thomas said from the doorway. "I'm enormous." "Beautifully enormous." He crossed to stand behind her, arms encircling her. "Sometimes I can't believe you're real, that you chose this life. Chose me." "I chose survival," Margaret corrected. "The love was a surprise gift. For both of us." 2 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, their son arrived with the dawn. The birth was hard. Frontier births always were. But Margaret faced it with the same courage she'd shown fighting outlaws. Thomas never left her side, letting her grip his hand hard enough to leave bruises. When Doc Hawkins placed the squalling infant in her arms, Margaret felt her heart expand beyond what she thought possible. "He's perfect," Thomas breathed, touching the baby's tiny fist with one trembling finger. "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "James," he said finally. "For your first husband, and Samuel, for Sam Edwards, who rode to our rescue. James Samuel Sullivan." Margaret looked up at him through tears. "You'd name him for James?" "He was part of your journey here," Thomas said simply. "Without him, without that loss, you might never have answered my advertisement. I won't be jealous of a ghost, not when that ghost led you to me." It was, Margaret thought, the most generous thing anyone had ever done for her. As she nursed little James while Thomas kept protective watch, a knock came at the door. Half the county, it seemed, had come to welcome the newest Sullivan. Emma Parsons brought a quilt she'd been secretly making. Sam Edwards contributed a hand-carved cradle. Even Gruff Miguel from the settlement appeared with a tiny pair of boots he'd crafted. "For when he rides with his papa," Miguel said, his weathered face soft with emotion. The house filled with laughter and congratulations, everyone wanting to see the baby and share in the joy. Margaret watched it all from her bed, Thomas beside her, their son peaceful in her arms. "Long way from that depot in Dry Creek," Thomas murmured. "Longer still from Boston." Margaret agreed. "Any regrets?" She looked around the room, at neighbors who'd become family, at the man who'd become her whole world, at the child who represented their future. Through the window, she could see their land stretching toward mountains purple with distance. It wasn't an easy life. Might never be easy, but it was theirs. "No regrets," she said. "Not one." As the sun set on that perfect autumn day, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas told their guests the story they all knew but never tired of hearing. "She was a mail-order bride," he began, his arm around Margaret, their son cradled between them. "And I was a fool rancher who kissed her before saying her name." "Shocked the whole town," Emma added with relish. "Shocked me too," Margaret laughed. "But it was the perfect beginning to an imperfect story." "Our story," Thomas corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And it's far from over." Outside, the evening star appeared in the deepening sky. Inside, surrounded by love and laughter, Margaret Sullivan mail-order bride turned frontier woman, factory worker turned rancher's wife, widow turned mother, knew she had found what she'd traveled so far to seek. Not just a new beginning, but a true home. Not just a practical arrangement, but a love worth fighting for. And not just a husband, but a partner in every sense of the word. The rancher had kissed her before saying her name. It was true, but in that impulsive moment, he'd claimed her heart forever, and she, in kissing him back, had claimed his. It was, as Thomas said, the perfect beginning to their perfectly imperfect story. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the Wild West, where love bloomed amid hardship and danger. We hope Margaret and Thomas's story touched your heart as it did ours. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this tale. Please share in the comments below. Are you by a cozy fireplace, on your daily commute, or perhaps even somewhere in the American West where these events unfolded? Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier love stories that capture the spirit of courage, resilience, and romance. Share your thoughts about Margaret and Thomas's journey. Did you see that first kiss coming? What was your favorite moment? Until our next adventure in the Old West, keep your hearts open and your spirits strong.